It's mentally healthy and safe workplaces. Quite often the health component of WHS gets missed. It's a poor cousin to safety, so great that we're throwing the lens over it today. My name's Glenn Farrell. I'm the Acting Director of the Educator arm of Safe Worker Say, and I'm pleased to see so many people here today taking the time out to get involved in National Safe Work Month. You can obviously continue the conversation by using your favourite social media platform, hashtag Safe Work Month, so please get on board with that. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that the land that we meet on here today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. Just a couple of housekeeping things to go through. So obviously in the case of emergency, we'll filter out through the doors that you've just entered into, and there's an emergency exit immediately to your left as you exit this particular theatre. There will be wardens that will be guiding us, and obviously sirens that will give us a heads up. If you're looking for any of the facilities, just keep an eye out for one of our Safe Work members who are all wearing high-vis today, so ask them any questions if you've got any queries. If you're wearing high-vis in the crowd, sorry, you might get a few questions thrown your way. Obviously, smoking is not permitted in this particular venue, and if we could show our courtesy to our speakers and to each other, if we could put our phones on silent, that would be great. Okay, so mentally healthy and safe workplaces. What we want to do first is invite three presenters up to the front to speak about various aspects of mental health and safe workplaces. We're then going to go and invite four other members up to the front for a question and answer session. So please, if you've got any questions that pop into your mind as the presenters are speaking, just make a note, and there's going to be plenty of time to ask those questions later. So first up, we've got the absolute pleasure of having Chris Burns, the SA Mental Health Commissioner, who became the Commissioner in July of last year. Chris is an experienced advocate and strategic planner. Commissioner Burns is a former military officer and consultant in defence and international relations. Most recently, he was the CEO of South Australia's Defence Industry Association, successfully campaigning for Australia's next fleet of submarines and surface ships to be built here in Australia. His a passion for improving services and ensuring people with lived experience of mental health illnesses are heard. Their families and carers are central to the Commissioner's work and the ongoing mental health reform. Commissioner Burns is taking a whole of person, whole of life, whole of community and a whole of government approach to the development of SA Health's mental health strategic plan. In leading this key task of the Commission, his focus is firmly on strengthening the mental well-being of South Australians. Please join me in welcoming Chris to the stage.
Thanks very much, Glenn, and it's great to see so many people here at what is a particularly important activity because we do neglect the mental health and well-being of South Australians in the workplace, and I just want to talk about that briefly this morning. From the intro, you'll recognise I have no clinical background whatsoever in mental health, and it's basically around defence. But through that involvement, I've had a lot to do with veterans, and not just around post-traumatic stress, but various forms of mental illness, both as a uniformed person and subsequently in the industry. And I was very, very concerned with the way veterans were being treated, which developed my passion for this area. When I came into the role in July last year, the discussion was all about why do mentally ill people spend so much time in the emergency department, and do we have enough mental health acute beds? And that to me told one story, that everyone was talking about mental illness, not mental health. And there was more to it than just the clinical, medical side of mental well-being. Caused us to have a bit of a look at what is the prevalence of what is the prevalence of mental illness. And it shows on that table there that it's that top 3.1% that actually need that acute care, the mental health services, the SA health support. So what are we doing about the rest of the population? What are we doing around the promotion, the prevention, the early intervention, so that we minimise the number of people that have to filter through to the top of that pyramid? And it was soon after I took over that the Prime Minister presented the inaugural Mental Health Award for Australia. And it struck me in this part of his speech where he highlighted that mental health and wellbeing is an issue for all of us. It's not just for the few who have to deal with it from a medical perspective. We have to measure it, not just in human happiness, but also in dollars. I would have flipped it away the way Randy said it, the way he said it. I would have said we should measure it firstly in human happiness, then we can worry about the dollars. And he introduced this concept of our mental wealth as a nation. And I found that quite interesting. What is the impact on our productivity and our growth and our mental wealth as a nation? So that begged us the question, well, what is the cost of mental health? And I'm going to focus that on that area today because that's probably what we'll hear about, to understand what's the impact of mental health and wellbeing on the workplace. It probably won't surprise you, or it may surprise you, that 1 in 5 Australian employees report that they have taken time off due to mental ill health. That's very consistent because at any point in time in Australia, 1 in 5, 20% of the population, are experiencing a diagnosable mental illness. And that's pretty surprising, very surprising for me when I first came into the role to hear that there was that level of prevalence. Another stark statistic is that 77% just in South Australia of all disease-related compensation claims are related to mental health. So it's indicating a really strong high prevalence, particularly in industry. What is the really strong statistic behind that is that of those people who do experience a diagnosable mental illness, 65% won't or can't access mental health services to support them. So that 77% is, when you put it in context, you think of how many people are experiencing a diagnosable mental illness but aren't getting the treatment or aren't reporting it in some way. And that amounts to us losing 19,000 of 25,000 working weeks every year. The survey we went through here, 91% of Australians believe that having a mentally healthy workplace is important. Only 86% believed that it was important to have a physically healthy workplace. So clearly it's an issue for the workforce out there, but what's being done about making sure that workplaces are mentally healthy? And I think if you think of your own workplace, and I presume we have a diverse range of workplaces represented here, it's a quick survey, how many people in this room have done a mental health first aid course? Just put your hand up. That's a good proportion. How many people have not heard of a mental health first aid course? Yeah. When I came to the job, I hadn't heard of it. And a little anecdote, they asked me to do a video for Are You OK Day, and I said, well, I'm a bit scared of Are You OK Day because I've always wondered what happens if I ask the question and they say, oh, I'm not feeling so great, because I didn't know the answer. And they said, well, you're off to a mental health first aid course. And I wish I'd done that course 30 years ago, because I would have done things a whole lot differently in my personal and professional life had I been vested with the knowledge that I gained from that first aid course. And it defies logic to me why we're not trying to put as many people through mental health first aid courses as we try to push through St John's first aid courses. So we have to improve the understanding, awareness and the education around mental health and wellbeing in the workplace. I think it was disappointing that 52% of workers believe their workplace is mentally healthy. You would want it to be a lot more than that, I would have thought. And only 56% believe that their leadership actually value having a mentally healthy workplace. And having come out of a defence industry, I don't believe we discussed the mentally healthy workplace policy enough. I don't know how many companies actually have mental health workplace policies. I've been in organisations where they talk in great detail about workplace health and safety from a physical perspective, but there's not a lot of discussion about how are we monitoring the mental well-being of our workforce. Getting to the crass point, I'm going to push that too far, hopefully not. How much does it actually cost? It's been calculated that it costs Australia $60 billion a year. Less than half of that is actually health services, the delivery of medical services. The greater proportion of it is lost productivity through compensation claims, absenteeism, and a phenomenon I hadn't heard of before known as presenteeism, where someone is in themselves experiencing some form of mental ill health, or someone close to them, be it a family member, a friend or a work colleague, is experiencing a mental health issue, and they are distracted. They are there in the workplace, but their mind is not on the job. That amounts to $4,000 per taxpayer, or $10,000 per family. Now, I think that's a shocking statistic, that's how much money we're losing in productivity. And indeed, PricewaterhouseCoopers produced a survey. They said that for every dollar you invest in the mental health of your workforce, at a minimum, you will get a $2.30 return. Now, from a pure business sense, that's a return on investment you truly want. But having come out of the defence industry, I can tell you, if you have a highly trained technician or engineer who's working on a highly classified submarine combat system, and their mind's not on the job and they make a mistake, it's tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage that can be done. So the $2.30 return increases exponentially. So if we think of that in our own workplaces, if people haven't got their mind on the job, they're not being productive, or they're making mistakes, the cost to the industry is quite significant. So what is... Very good, isn't it? I've skipped that. So in summary, I started with one Prime Minister's quote, and I'll conclude with another's. And this quote came from Julia Gillard the other night at the annual Hawke lecture, which was given in the town hall. And Julia Gillard has recently taken over as the chair of Beyond Blue, as you'd be aware. But she made this particularly significant point that I think we should all take consciousness of, is that we have to stop looking at mental health through the prism of mental illness. It's not all about that acute end of the spectrum. That end of the spectrum is incredibly important. And our look at the figures in South Australia is we are particularly well served in the medical health services we have here in South Australia to support those people who are experiencing the acute end of the spectrum. What we have to do is look at how do we get that promotion, that prevention, that early in life intervention. How do we get people doing mental health first aid courses? How do we get employers talking about mental health in the workplace? How do we invest in our future workforce and make sure that we're building their resilience up so that they get better academic results, are better human beings, and in the future will be a better workforce? And how do we make sure we continue to look after our workforce once they've left the workplace? Because we can always build the resilience of people throughout their whole life, and we have to deal with the mental health of people throughout their whole life. So we in the Commission here, as was mentioned, are developing a strategic plan for South Australia for mental health and wellbeing, and we truly will be taking that whole of person. It's not just about the psychological aspects, that whole of life. There's stages of life that we have to treat people differently. The whole of government is not just about SA Health, and that whole of community. We all have a role and a responsibility in ensuring we have a mentally healthy and mentally wellbeing South Australia. So I hope I've set the scene for that. Thank you very much.
thanks a lot, Chris, and I think that's set the scene beautifully for the rest of our speakers today. Obviously, it's an issue that's on a lot of people's radars, which is a good thing, of course, because it means that we can start to focus a little bit more. Some of those last points that Chris made about the how can we do this, how can we do that, where do we start? Hopefully, as this session goes on, some of those questions may be answered, but certainly we've got a great line-up of panel members that can hopefully give you some answers to those questions. Let's bring it now down to the actual workplace. So our next speaker is Barry Shepherd. Barry is managing our community retail and services team at Safe Work SA. He's going to talk to us about duties of those at the workplace. So it's not just about the workers, it's management and obviously senior management. He has a background in law enforcement, safety regulation in the federal and state jurisdictions. He has worked in the private sector as consultant, providing advice, audits and training to businesses. Barry has been involved in workplace investigations across a range of industry sectors and has qualifications in work health and safety, training and assessment, health and governance. Please join me in welcoming Barry to the mic.
Thank you, Glenn. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to speak to you on National Safe Work Month, and Chris, I thought it was excellent. Some of the details you gave and some of the statistics helped sharpen the story around mental health in the workplace. Safe Work SA is an interesting place to work at. I've been there 2 years, but it's not my first spell in safety regulation. But I suppose at Safe Work we really cross over that boundary of talking about health, mental health in the workplace, and actually interact with people at the point that they want to bring their personal story about the situation they're in at their workplace to light and speak to a regulator. So it's an interesting position to be in to hear both employer and employee perspective on what's happening in their workplace at the point in time in their life that they come to speak to us. So I'm going to run through a few things. Some of it's about the legislation, but some is about the work we're doing at Safe Work SA as well. So this morning I'm going to cover some aspects of the Work Health Safety Act and how they interact with mental health and certainly around personal health in the workplace. We're going to talk about the responsibilities of businesses, employers, workers as well. We're going to touch on workers' individual responsibilities and that relationship with the Work Health Safety Act. And we're going to talk about the role of the Work Environment Unit, which is Safe Work's operational unit around mental health in the workplace, around workplace behaviour, around complaints that are made to us. I'm the pleasure of being the manager of that unit at present. And it's got some, what I think, some particularly hard-working and talented inspectors working in it. I'm also going to talk about how Safe Work handles psychological complaints, and I've deliberately not used the word bullying complaint there. There's been a perspective in the past, in my view, that regulators and such organisations are focused on workplace bullying at the exclusion of other psychological risks in the workplace. So I'll talk a bit about that today, but I'm not pretending to be an expert on it. I'm learning as a public servant about these things in the workplace and about how some of them are best served by our legislation. So just to talk about some of the challenges that I see in So just talk about the Work Health Safety Act generally. It's a fairly new piece of legislation and has some duties both for individuals, organisations, and also some of the individuals at the top of those organisations, officers. You could read that as directors or people that essentially run the business or have a great deal of influence over it. But there's duties for workers as well, and so those duties are not transferable. We can't transfer our duty to somebody else. We can't contract that duty out. The nature of the Work Health Safety Act is its penalties and consequences are quite high, certainly much higher than the legislation it succeeded. Health is actually defined within the Work Health Safety Act, and Section 3 of it, sorry, on the slide. Section 3 of it talks about Health and Safety and defines it as physical and psychological health. So it's actually part of our legislation. From my perspective, what I'm seeing as working in this area is that certainly when a psychological hazard like personal behaviour, an individual's personal behaviour in the workplace is identified, it certainly can have both a psychological and a physical effect on that individual and on others around that situation in the workplace. One of the things that we find is that many employers that we engage with still think in terms of health and safety, in terms of the physical risk to an individual, in terms of people think of trip hazards, they think of hazards around machinery, they think of hazards in relation to working in a workplace and sustaining physical injury. And one of the challenges is to bring employers out of thinking in just a safety paradigm and bring them into understanding that a risk to mental health is simply another risk within the workplace. And from some of the statistics that Chris brought up, there's good reason to focus on health and safety, and particularly psychological health in the workplace. Many times that we see that the traditional industrial way of dealing with behaviour in the workplace gets tied up with or diverted from the normal safety message or from the traditional safety message, and some of those things translate into organisation systems as well, because organisations seem to be focused on physical risk. Their system of safety within their business tends to deal very well with that physical risk, but deals poorly, and when we regulate in this space, find that there's often a lack of attention given to psychological risk, psychological health, and the consequences of people's behaviour in the workplace. So employers' responsibilities, just to talk a little bit on that. One of the central part of the legislation is section 19 of the Work Health Safety Act, which is around the primary duty of care. And I've distilled it down a bit and picked the most relevant parts of that piece of the Act. And the employer's duty is as far as reasonably practicable to provide the following things in the workplace. And some of them, for me, have a link to mentally healthy workplaces. Providing a safe working environment, that's the primary objective of this part of the legislation and the Act in general. But providing safe systems of work, providing information, training, instruction and supervision to workers, and monitoring the health of workers and conditions at the workplace. Now, so easily we come across employers that do this very well when their employees are dealing with heavy metals or hazardous chemicals or carcinogens. They're very practiced at measuring and monitoring that kind of health risk in the workplace. But notice that it says health there and not safety. So to my mind, what it takes us back to is the primary part of the legislation that talks around health being psychological and physical well-being. How to go at distilling down, for me, the links, the practical links from the legislation into what we see or we hope to see in a workplace that's working well in this space. So on the left, I've listed the aspects of the legislation. On the right, I've listed the application that we like to see in the workplace. And certainly when we speak to companies in the regulation mode, we engage and say, look, there's a problem, there's a risk in your business. We're looking for these things in relation to the legislation. So one of the employees' duties is to provide a safe working environment. And for us, what we're looking at when we regulate is what kind of culture an organisation has, the relationships between its workers and management, its supervisors and workers, and individuals within that equation. And also the interactions that people are having in the workplace. So often it's those interactions which form or the malfunction of those interactions that form the complaints that are made to us. What would safe systems of work look like in a workplace that was performing well here? It looked like a workplace that had relevant policies, procedures and processes for dealing with interactions between people. And what I mean by that is inappropriate workplace behaviour procedures, training associated with that, and supervision around the situations where those interactions are going wrong and which are the source of complaints. Providing induction, training reasonable direction and supervision really is at the core of some of these issues. Is that, and Chris asked some questions about how many of us knew about mental health first aid, and some of us did, some of us have been on the courses. There's a real lack of understanding at times we find around what training employers should give their workers, and more relevantly, what training employers should give their leaders around this type of workplace interactions that so often go wrong and are the cause or the beginning of someone's poor mental health journey. Monitoring the health of workers in the workplace, it is defined and easy in places where there's a high risk. So monitoring around the handling of carcinogenic chemicals is easy, they're well established, but how do we monitor someone's mental health in the workplace? How do we monitor the mental health of a workforce? There's many ways that which it can be done. Some of the things which are accessible for a lot of employers are things like accessing where employers have employee assistance programs, accessing that statistical data, surveying the workforce, carrying out exit interviews, and through a really good practice around supervision and meeting with the workforce and workforce representatives. Individuals can't be forgotten within this narrative. There's lots of places to talk about what an employer's responsibility is, but so often these things start with individuals, and there are some individual responsibilities around the legislation. So I'll just talk a little on those. The top bullet point is kind of well known, I think, around individual behaviour, in the sense that you've got a responsibility for your own health and safety. The second dot point is where we start to see things going wrong in workplaces. It's around where you've got to take reasonable care that your own acts or omissions do not adversely affect the health and safety of other persons. And this is so often the case where someone's personal behaviour is impacting on another. I'll use the term bullying, it's an easy, readily available example. Where there's workplace bullying, that's about someone's personal behaviour and their projection of it onto somebody else. And then the consequences for that person are so often the basis of complaints to us. The Omission To Act is an interesting one, because for me that translates into an omission to act, so commonly translates into an omission to act by a supervisor or manager. So where that's an evident behaviour in the workplace and the supervisor or manager makes themselves aware of it, they do have a duty to act, and their omission to act runs contrary to this legislation. So where someone's behaviour is identified as a hazard, a risk to someone else in the workplace, omission to act in that point for me really is part of this legislation, and it's saying that you as an individual worker in the workplace that has supervisory responsibilities has a duty under this legislation to act when the risk becomes evident in the workplace. That might be for a complaint or your own observations. There's certainly a duty as a supervisor or manager to take those steps. The next two dot points, if we're not careful, they can blend, but essentially it's around an individual worker has to comply so far as they're reasonably able with any reasonable instruction given by an employer. So this is around dealing with the behaviour, and comes more into focus for me, and examples I've seen of it is where if we do identify poor behaviour in the workplace that's impacting someone's health, their psychological health, then it's quite reasonable for employers to give employees directions, reasonable directions around their behaviour. When the employee fails to deal with that or fails to respond to that reasonable direction, their behaviour is running contrary to this legislation. Likewise, the final dot point is around the employee's duty, the worker's duty to cooperate with any policy or procedure of the employer once they've been notified of it. What do we think notified? The legislation talks about the word notified. What do you think that could be? How would that practically interpret into the workplace if an employee is notified of a reasonable policy or procedure? For me, that's around the employer's duty to tell the worker about it, and usually the most common mechanism or vehicle for that is training. Once an employee is trained by their employer, they're certainly, from my perspective, notified of a reasonable policy or procedure that their employer is operating so they can comply with the legislation. So for me, that word notified means they've been told about it, they've been trained about it, and they're aware of it. slide's not moving, so I'll just speak. Always happens, doesn't it? The next slide, if it were up, would show you a few dot points around the work environment unit. So I've just talked about the legislation, but we'll talk about how it works for SafeWork and how we operate that legislation as a regulator. So one of the aspects of that is that SafeWork about 12 months ago changed its shape. Some of you may know about it, but I'll talk very briefly. We changed from the shape of changed to having an educator and a regulator within the organisation. I work for the regulator in SafeWork SA. My colleague Glenn works for the educator. So we're very much one agency, but we've kind of two complementing missions. And the mission we're on is around enforcing the Work Health Safety Act. And one of the tools that we use for that is our work environment unit. That's a unit of inspectors that commenced work in July 2016. 4 inspectors, 1 team leader, and they report to myself. This is a team of inspectors that are experienced and has some training in this area. A lot of them, the 4 inspectors, certainly have broad experience of a lot of workplaces and workplace situations. They conduct early assessments with complaints. They conduct early interventions in complaints that are made to us. There we go. Thank you, Luke. It won't surprise you that the vast majority of complaints to us are made about workplace bullying. That's changing, I think. There's more tendency for the complaints that come to us now to focus on things other than workplace bullying, so other workplace risks that are psychological in nature. What do I mean by that? So put some words around it. Some workplaces, the way they're designed, the workflow is designed, how the work responsibility, how the lines of reporting and supervision are designed, we find sometimes set up to fail at times, or to overload individuals, or to undertask individuals, and these things can create a psychological risk in themselves. It's always the squeaky wheel that gets the oil in life, and often a bullying complaint can sound really serious because that one individual's reached crisis point in their life and they want to talk about what's happened in the workplace. Sometimes the more challenging complaints to deal with are where a workforce is struggling because of the way the workplace is set up, or the change that they're undergoing. So change management's another organisational risk factor that can cause mental health issues in the workplace, especially where a large organisation, a multi-site organisation with a lot of employees, is undergoing large structural change. That can cause health issues, mental health issues for some employees. The inspectors in this unit use a number of tools around enforcement. So it's not all about a big stick approach. A little it's around understanding what the nature of the complaint is and talking to employees about the systems that are in place. But ultimately, when we do find a breach of legislation, we do tend to act fairly swiftly. We think it's justified, and we use things like improvement notices or prohibition notices, or we refer matters for full criminal investigation when they're serious enough to do so. But we also refer matters quite frequently down to our colleagues in the educator. So often we find that the issues that we see is the end point where we can often identify that there was an opportunity to de-escalate things or change the nature of things at some point on. And some of that can be best dealt with by an education approach, which we commonly refer some of our businesses that we deal with down to our colleagues in the educator. I'll talk briefly about complaint handling. I'll talk briefly about complaint handling, extreme one. So complaint handling, it was a good graphic actually, because it helped me explain what it was like. So I'm hoping it'll pop up in a second. Complaint handling for us comes in 3 stages. The first stage is around the caller making contact with us and us prioritising that complaint and prioritising its importance in terms of driving our actions in the regulator. A caller contacts our help centre and speaks to a call operator. That call operator records the information as accurate as they can, provides some initial advice on the phone, but ultimately what they're doing is making an early decision, thank you, about the priority of that matter. That's passed very quickly on to one of my team leaders. The team leader makes a priority decision, uses some criteria that our teams develop, their work environment team, to assign a priority to that complaint that's made to us. They confirm the priority and then they allocate it to one of our inspectors. Our inspectors makes initial contact. Usually the initial contact is the complainant, the person who feels they're most at risk in the situation and has taken the trouble to pick the phone up and speak to us. The first point of contact by the inspector is usually that person. That point gives us a chance to make a more in-depth assessment about what's going on and some of the risks around that person. Sometimes people are in crisis point when they speak to us, and we can sometimes hear and they verbalise self-harm when we speak to them, and we have a procedure we go through when that's the case. Some people are really just also at the other end of the scale, just want to be heard and speak because they feel that that's not happening in their workplace and they're not able to access that. We, after our initial intervention into it, go into a case conference where the team of inspectors with their team leader and myself look at how we're going to handle this complaint that we've got. We've got a couple of things that we do. The first level is that if it's an education issue, as sometimes we find it is, we can refer to our educator, or we very commonly infer that individual off to a range of services that we are aware of. The names you've heard of, mental health services, Beyond Blue, the referrals that we do make with people. It doesn't change the nature of the action we take, but we make those referrals fairly quickly. But with the situation that we find that one of the things is to speak to the person, find out what the story is, and then intervene in that matter by contacting the employer and asking for the employer's version of events and seeking their side of the story as well. Because there are so often two sides to a story which have to be looked at by us. That can lead to some enforcement action, that can lead to improvement notices or prohibition notices with the employer, or it can lead to the other course of action, which is for the most serious issues where we refer for a criminal investigation by our investigation team. The complaint process in 3 stages, sometimes it goes really quickly. Sometimes matters are complex and they do take a long time to understand, because often when people call us, this has been going on sometimes for people for 2 or 3 years at times. For them it's a very long story and we're often at the end of that. So sometimes complaints can take a long time to handle. Sometimes they're fairly quick and have a quick resolution and outcome. To say a complaint took a certain amount of time, I'd be guessing every time I said that, but sometimes they're very long and sometimes they're concise. Last slide. Maybe not. Just to talk about some of the challenges that we're facing regulating the space. The first one is where we do refer matters for full criminal investigation because they're at that level of seriousness, the burden of proof's really high. It's a piece of legislation which requires beyond all reasonable doubt. And where there's been 2 or 3 years of history around what's happened, that's really challenging to get into statements, to get into accounts from people and really do justice to 2 years or 3 years of history in that person's life around what's been happening at work. So it's a real challenge for us, and it's something that we're trying to improve on and really do a good job to collect that evidence. But it is challenging, I won't hide from that. It's beyond all reasonable doubt, it's a high standard to reach in these situations. There's a real misunderstanding, I find, in the workplace also, and it's only fair to look at this perspective. There's a lot of misunderstanding around workers around what's reasonable management action. So workers so often confuse bullying with reasonable management action. So often we find ourselves educating callers that have spoken to us where they're displeased or unhappy about legitimate management action that's been taken against them. So where a manager or a supervisor takes reasonable steps to coach someone, improve their performance, warn them about poor performance, these are all legitimate functions of reasonable management action. And so often there's confusion in a worker, where a worker has confused that duty of a manager or a supervisor to reasonably manage them with in their mind, a form of bullying. And so often we're educating people over what bullying is, the definition of workplace bullying, as put down in their guide by Safe Work Australia. So often we bring people back to that definition and explain that to them. And often we find that they come to a self-realisation that what's happening to them is management action. But in many cases, I have to contrast that with the fact that what is happening is unreasonable management action. So this is the area of space that we find ourselves playing in. There's a growing demand for regulators to operate in this space, and there's a real challenge to match enforcement action with education as well. And there's a need for case law. We don't have a lot of case law in work health safety space in South Australia around mental health. So there's a real challenge to find some case law in the future. And just lastly, one of the jobs that we try and do is influence the businesses that we have contact with to understand that health does mean physical and psychological health in the workplace. And we try and reinforce that message every time that we speak to them. So that's all I had to say this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. I think what's interesting to note from Barry's presentation is the fact that the legislation is now broadened out to recognise other psychological risk factors that can present themselves in the workplace. So the other thing to be mindful, I suppose, of is although there is legislation, we want people to almost take it on board that it's a duty of care as opposed to a duty of compliance. I think the same with any hazard in the workplace. It's not about trying to just put somebody through a course and hope that fixes the problem. Just like any other risk in the workplace, it's about ongoing monitoring and review. So I'm mindful of the control not working properly, and there's nothing worse. So I'm just going to test it. No. Now, have we got full control at the back to be able to advance the slides? Right. So our next presenter may have to just give a little signal in order for the slides to be advanced, so apologies for that. So our next speaker. Our next speaker is Marty Weather from Return to Work SA. We're staying in the workplace, obviously. We're going to hear from her about what mentally healthy workplaces actually look like. So Marty, being from Return to Work SA, obviously deals with people that have been affected and potentially have lodged a claim. So she's dealing with people that are on the other end of the spectrum. So Marty's a mentally healthy workplace consultant. She's 25 years experience in work health and safety and injury management with both the private and public sectors across a diverse range of industries. She's a registered psychologist and safety professional with an in-depth knowledge and understanding of contemporary workplace issues such as organisational culture, risk factors that impact on psychological health in the workplace, as well as solutions for minimising risk. So we all know that, I think we all know deep down that these issues exist, but what can we actually do to try and address these? So please welcome Marty to the mic.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming today to talk about a really important topic, mentally healthy workplaces. And thanks Commissioner Burns and Barry Shepherd for your presentations as well. So my presentation is actually focusing in on what does a mentally healthy workplace look like. And so when we're talking about a mentally healthy workplace, I first have to acknowledge the fantastic work of the Mental Health Workplace Alliance. It's a national approach in supporting businesses to create more mentally healthy workplaces. The Alliance was formed in 2013. You can see all the logos of the Alliance members. And it's an alliance between the government sector, the mental health sector, and importantly the business sector that came together to recognise the benefits of all Australians focusing on a mentally healthy workplace. The business sector in the Alliance is significant. Workplace mental health was no longer seen as the nice to have, but rather a necessity from an economic and productivity perspective. And I think Commissioner Burns has outlined those economic benefits quite clearly. Out of the Alliance and Beyond Blue, who's a partner here, we've got Catherine Doherty here today, which is fantastic, from Beyond Blue. came Heads Up, and Heads Up's a website to give individuals and businesses the tools to create mentally healthy workplaces, and I'll talk about that website at the end of my presentation. Shall I have a go? Oh, okay. Okay. So what is a mentally healthy workplace? Commissioner Burns talked about the prevalence of mental health conditions in Australia, and we know that mental health conditions are affecting 1 in 5 Australians right now. So a mentally healthy workplace is about supporting those 1 in 5 people affected by a mental health condition, but it's more than that. It's about the 5 in 5 people coming to work. And it's a workplace that benefits everyone. So we can contribute positively, we can do our best work, and we can actually stay well in the workplace. So it is a better workplace for everyone. Next one. Okay, so what is a mentally healthy workplace in a little bit more detail? A mentally healthy workplace has a positive workplace culture. And what I mean by that is that there's no distinction between physical and mental health. And so what I mean is that we can quite often have open discussions about physical injuries. If we've got an injury, we'll go into the workplace, we'll say, look, you know, on the weekend I hurt my leg, you know, and we can talk about what adjustments need to be made in the workplace. We want to be able to have the same open conversations with someone that's actually struggling with a mental health condition about what reasonable adjustments and supports may be needed in the workplace so that they can continue working. It's a workplace where we do raise awareness of mental health conditions and reduce stigma. So it's looking at, you know, what do we include in induction? Do we actually talk about mental health at induction? Do we provide mental health information sessions about mental health literacy, signs and symptoms, support services that are available? We know stigma around mental illness remains an issue in Australia, and it does delay people from seeking the help that they need. So we want to actually hear about people's stories. There's some fantastic people with lived experience that come out to workplaces to talk about their experience and recovery process. We've got SA Mental Health Commission have got some fantastic anti-stigma videos that talk about their stories to break down stigma, stereotypes and misconceptions. It is about supporting people with mental health conditions without stigma and without discrimination in the workplace. And it's about building confidence to have open conversations about stresses, struggles and illnesses. So we want to be able to make sure that we support managers and supervisors, that they do have the confidence. If they know that someone is struggling in the workplace, they have the confidence to actually be able to have that conversation and have that supportive response to that worker, not to fix the problem, not to counsel the person, but just to connect them with the support that they need. Barry gave a great talk about the fact that health is both physical and psychological health within the work health safety legislation. I was very excited when the new Act came out and there was a definition of health. And so, you know, I talk to workplaces about, do you have a health and safety committee? Does your health and safety committee actually talk about mental health as much as they talk about physical health and safety issues? So are we actually openly talking about unhealthy stressors that may be available, we may be seeing in workplaces? Things like workloads, preventing bullying and harassment, and managing change effectively. And just like the physical health and safety program, I think Barry talked about the roles and responsibilities that both employers and employees have in the workplace. It's the same for a mentally healthy workplace. Everyone does have a role to play in creating that workplace. I just want to talk a little bit about culture, and I noticed that Barry's safe system of work linked with culture. And so I do like to talk about culture when I go out to workplaces, and I guess a really simple way of talking about culture is the way we do things around here. Maybe it's the way we do things when people aren't looking or watching, and we know that culture can have a huge impact on how we feel about being at work. We wake up in the morning and go, great, we're coming to work today. We were in a really supportive workplace culture. Whether we feel that our efforts add value, whether we do things willingly, whether we follow rules, whether we put effort in into what we're working on. And so one of the questions I do ask workplaces, perhaps if I'm working with a leadership group or a team within a workplace, I'll say, what do you think is meant by a positive workplace culture when we're talking about workplace mental health? And so I decided to actually capture some of the words that people were saying. If I could have the next slide, please. And this is the words that recent participants came up. It was actually a workplace that I was working with. It was a leadership team. And this is what they describe as a positive workplace culture when it comes to mental health. And it really made me sit back and reflect on it. And so the words, there's lots of words there, but words include support, trust, caring for each other, feeling valued, really generally being listening to, asking the genuine question, are you okay? And so you can see that all these words are actually coming from a caring perspective. It's actually a culture of care. It's more than just having to do something because it is minimum legislative compliance. Interestingly, with this leadership group, I actually went round and asked them how long they'd been working in the organisation. And I think the minimum was 4 years, but most of the people in this organisation, most of the leaders in the organisation have been in this organisation for 10, 20 or more years. So very, very low turnover. Really loved working in this workplace. And the other thing I really noticed was the sense of connection within the workplace. So I had to walk from one end of the workplace to the other, and everyone smiled and greeted and said hello to me in the morning. And I thought, wow, this is really great. You know, I could feel this actually positive workplace culture. So, are we there yet? It's probably a good question when we come to, are we there yet as far as creating mentally healthy workplaces in Australia? So Super Friends' annual work in progress survey report, some of the results have come out from that, and they surveyed more than 5,000 workers, business owners and managers. And so what this showed was 36% of participants believed that mental health and wellbeing was a big problem, but it was not being addressed in most businesses. 44% of participants said that workplaces focus on physical health, but not mental health, which I guess is what Barry was saying. 42% of participants left a job because of poor mental health and wellbeing environment. 28% believe there was a culture of compliance at their workplace and employers only do what they have to do. And 51% of participants were not aware of any mental health and wellbeing policies in their organisation. So I guess overall it does show that we still have some way in creating mentally healthy workplaces in Australia, where we do place the same importance on mental health as in physical health and safety. But I'm an optimist, and I can say that in my role at Return to Work SA, I've been at Return to Work SA now for 19 months, I'm finding more and more workplaces are recognising the importance of mentally healthy workplaces. Some workplaces are actively implementing their strategy, and others are just starting that journey. They're still seeking advice and information about what they can do, where the resources are and how they can implement that strategy. So it doesn't matter where you are on that journey as long as you actually do start that journey. So the critical success factors then, when you're developing a mentally healthy workplace program, it's really important, absolutely critical, that we get senior management commitment. And that senior management commitment has to be a visible commitment. It really needs to be shown that senior management generally believe in creating this mentally healthy workplace. They can role model the positive day-to-day behaviours and actions, and they can ensure all senior leaders have this shared commitment and belief in the goal and commit the resources that are needed to make it successful. Just like any other health and safety program, a mentally healthy workplace needs that employee participation as well, to get the employees' input about what they think is important within the workplace as far as mentally healthy workplaces, and also to keep them informed of what's going as the strategy progresses. There's some fantastic employee champions in workplaces that really want to get involved in relation to workplace mental health. So if you can tap into those champions, it's a great way to really, embed it within the organisation as well. And I think it's really important to build sustainability. So it's really important to not see mental health as a once-off tick and flick, let's go and do a mental health session and then we've done mental health in the workplace. It's looking at building sustainability, and when I talk to senior leaders, I ask them, where's your values? Can I have a look at your values? Can we see how your values actually link in with a mentally healthy workplace? What about your organisational goals, action plans, policies and procedures? Looking at embedding mental health within those goals, strategies and policies. So the other question, I guess, is how does this link with physical health in the workplace? And it's important to remember that mental and physical health is fundamentally linked. And we know that lifestyle factors can influence the state of both physical and mental health, such as exercise, diet, smoking, drugs and alcohol. And a healthy lifestyle can make a big difference to our mental health as well as our physical health. So many organisations are looking at an integrated approach. When they're looking at a wellbeing program, they're looking at not only mental health but physical health and safety, or physical health as well. And so we've got Corey Stewart from SA Health here today. She's going to be on the panel. And SA Health have done some fantastic work in relation to wellbeing and in the physical health space, and we'll hear more about that as well. So where to start? The really, I think, fantastic news is that there are some fantastic free tools and resources that are available for workplaces to create a mentally healthy workplace. Whenever I go out to workplaces, I say, look, your first starting point should be the Heads Up website, headsup.org.au. It has case studies, personal stories, videos, tools, e-learning modules. It has different entry points. So if you're an employer and want to know how do you go about creating a mentally healthy workplace, or what's my roles and responsibilities from a legislative point of view, I can go in there. If I'm an employee, I want to know about my own mental health, about stress and what I can do to manage my mental health or my mental health condition, then there's a portal entry point for that. If you're a manager and want to know how can I have conversations with people that I think might be struggling in the workplace, or how can I support someone in the workplace with a mental health condition, there's information there. And if you're a small business owner, there's a specific portal that relates to small business tools and resources that you can actually use to create a mentally healthy workplace within small business. We're really fortunate in South Australia. We have a fantastic free and confidential mental health support service that's available, that's called New Access, and this was developed by Beyond Blue. And New Access is available for anyone in South Australia 16 years above who is stressed or struggling or with low to moderate depression and anxiety. And New Access allows that person to access 6 free coaching sessions. And those coaching sessions can be face-to-face, over the phone or via Skype. The face-to-face is on Greenhill Road. But if you're regional, over the phone or Skype. The New Access coach is specifically trained and experienced in a technique that's called low-intensity cognitive behaviour therapy. And they will support the person with their particular problem with some self-help techniques, coach them through that to get them back on track. It breaks down a lot of the barriers for people actually seeking help as well. Of course, you can talk to your employer about New Access or talk to your GP, but you can also self-refer, and so you can access New Access by just directly ringing that number and getting in contact with a coach. And that coach will be available within 7 business days of someone making that phone call. Support services, when you're thinking about what support services can we promote within a workplace, then The other South Australian resource that's available is the resources that have been developed through SA Health, through the Healthy Worker and Healthy Futures initiative. And this initiative has tools, templates and resources available on the website to assist businesses to systematically work through the process of planning and implementing a workplace health and wellbeing program, which includes both physical and mental health strategies. The strategy focuses in on what's called the SNAP factors, so it's smoking, nutrition, alcohol and physical activity, but it also includes mental health. And there's some great audit tools and resources that are available on that website. And there's also a free advisory services available for certain eligible industries. So if you're in construction, manufacturing, defence, or if you work with apprentices, then there's a free advisory services available. So perhaps talk to Corey afterwards if you fall within those industries. If you don't fall within those industries, still go to the website because, as I said before, there's some great free tools and resources that are available. So that's all I had to say. So overall, there's some really excellent free tools and resources that are available to assist workplaces to take action in the area of workplace mental health. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. What's good to see is that so many initiatives are developing resources in line with small business. This is a small business state. I think something like 96% of businesses in SA are small business. So great to see that the resources are being developed specifically for those that can then build up and implement programs quite easily in their workplace. Okay, we're now going to invite up some other panel members to the front. So I hope you've been scribbling down lots of questions to ask. So I'll introduce them individually. First of all, Sandra Den, Director, Working Women's Centre. A position she's held since 1998. The Centre provides information, support, training and advocacy to women who are not union members but have been several workplace issues. Sandra is on numerous committees and advisory groups and is past convener of the TAFE Women's Education Course Advisory Panel. Sandra is a founding member of and advisor to the Board of Staff at the Working Women's Centre in Timor-Leste and has been working with women there with Alfida Union Aid Abroad since 2009. Very dedicated. Sandra is accredited by Safe at Home, Safe at Work project, delivering training on domestic and family violence and work in South Australia. So please join us on one of the chairs, please, Sandra. We also have Luke Holland from Spark Helmore Lawyers. Luke is one of South Australia's leading workplace lawyers. He advises a range of employers on employment and work health and safety issues and is known for his practical and balanced approach. Luke is currently named as is on the list of best lawyers in Australia for occupational health and safety category. He's also a hell of a nice guy. As referred to earlier, Corey Stewart, Chief Project Officer, Healthy Workers, Healthy Futures Initiative with SA Health. In this role, Corey supports state action around workplace health and wellbeing and works to build the capacity of South Australian businesses and industry to create healthy workplaces. Corey has over 15 years' experience in the health promotion field, the majority of which has been spent in the workplace setting. She's a wealth of experience at both the operational level, supporting workplaces to promote health and wellbeing of their staff, and at a strategic level in developing policy and programs. Welcome, Corey. Also, as mentioned earlier, Catherine Doherty from Workplace Engagement Manager with Beyond Blue, a national not-for-profit organisation that provides information and support to help everyone in Australia achieve their best possible mental health. Catherine has extensive experience in health, safety and wellbeing and has had a broad exposure to a range of workplaces through roles as a consultant with a major insurer, as well as project management and leadership roles in the not-for-profit and public sectors. Catherine has a passion for building capability in people and organisations to prevent injury and improve mental health at work. So welcome, Catherine. I've asked our three presenters also to join the panel. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge so far. So what we will have got is two roving mics that come down both sides of the audience. So if anybody has a question and would just like to raise their hand, and we'll bring a mic straight over to you. One at a time, please.
All right, I'll kick it off. Marty, thank you very much for the presentation. It was great. Looking at some synergy with messaging from Barry as well, what have you seen in research or personal experience in terms of the efficacy of training programs for mental health, such as things like mental health first aid, to actually deliver actual outcomes for organisations versus, I guess, time spent in the design phase or design area of designing work environments, workflows, spending time into getting great equipment and tools for people to actually impact on the mental health of workers.
Thank you. That's Brian. I can't see where you are, Brian. Okay, that's a great question. Thank you. I think it's building a strategy that addresses both. So I think that part of the mentally healthy workplace is definitely looking at good job design and looking at reducing those unhealthy job stressors. But I think it's also an education part as well. So I think the education part, I believe the education part because it does help build that culture. It helps break down the stigma because you're actually talking about mental health in the workplace. So I think it's a combined approach of the design aspect of it, but also building that culture by actually talking about mental health and building that education piece into workplaces as well. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, I think it's just about the prompts of just sort of think about, if you've got the things that are actually leading to, there's a lot of focus on resilience in resilience training that I've certainly been aware of in organisations and trying to help people become more resilient. But if you don't take out the stressor factors or deal with those as a source, there's only so much training you can give someone. And again, we've been looking at the mental health first aid, but we're really struggling to see the dynamic research that is indicating the actual improvement, if you like, in terms of mental health issues at workplace from programs such as mental health first aid. So
I get exactly what you're saying. I think it needs to be a combined approach. I think you do have to look at job design and you have to look at looking at the stresses within workplaces and addressing those, absolutely. But I have seen some really good results as far as I look at, it's not research as in evidence-based research, it's just anecdotal evidence that I've got that workplaces that have done mental health training or have done training through their managers and supervisors, and then they've gone to their teams and talked about workplace mental health. They're telling me that those teams and workplaces are having much more open conversations about mental health, that the workers are feeling much more confident about talking to their managers if they're stressed or struggling, and actually building strategies in place for those individuals as well. So I think a combined approach does work effectively.
Marty, if I might just go and add something to that, just to join in the conversation. Absolutely, from Beyond Blue's perspective, we would encourage organisations to take a holistic approach and create an integrated approach to mental health in the workplace. But the key thing we would always say is just start small and do something. And if mental health first aid is a natural addition to upskilling some people in your team as a way of increasing awareness, increasing people's confidence to reach out and have a conversation, to just start something relating to improving mental health in the workplace, then that's a good start. But ideally it would be part of a strategic approach where you are looking at enhancing those protective factors in the workplace to make work a great place to be, because we know from the literature and the data that work in and of itself is a protective factor for mental health for most people. And then in addition to that, looking at the risks in the workplace, the job demands, the work stress, the lack of role clarity, how do you put those systems in place how do you put a mental health lens over your return to work plan and your return to work planning strategies and policies and processes, so that you have all of those systems kind of linked up. Keeping in mind that it's a long-term prospect, and it could take some years, as it has for safety and workplace engagement and organisational culture. But starting small within the capabilities and the interest in your organisation is somewhere that you should start and make a start, would be my view.
Just a question down there, just while we're getting the mic over there. I think for a lot of small businesses, it's quite often, where do I start? You know, what's the first step I need to sort of take to start to change the culture in my workplace? And it is, as Brian mentioned, you can implement things, but culture isn't something that can change overnight. It's something that evolves and becomes, as Marty said, this is how we do things now around here. So with it being quite overwhelming, quite possibly to small business, what would be the first steps that they could take? How could they get on board and start that culture change?
Well, I'm happy to start that conversation. We'll correct down the line. But one of the key things we would say to small business owners is lead by example. Think about how you could take care of your own mental health first. And think about the strategies that enable you as a small business owner to be most effective in your working environment and in your workplace. Demonstrate, effective time management, effective leave taking, good relationships with your people. And some of the feedback that we hear is that small business can be better placed to look after the mental health of their employees because they're not hampered by an HR department. I think that's a little bit harsh, but that is one perspective. If you're in a small business, you have more contact potentially with the people that you employ, and so that's a great strategy. And something that's quite useful and you may not be aware of, I have the advantage of being based in Victoria, so for those of you who may not yet know, I don't know how far it's filtered, but the Victorian Small Business Commission have just released a mental health planning tool for small business. And Beyond Blue are very fortunate to have participated in the development of that tool, and it really brings mental health back into a business risk perspective, and it encourages small business owners to look at mental health as a small business risk along with financial risk, supplier risk, and all of the other aspects of running a small business.
Hi, just picking up on the point of leading by example, and I understand that the politicians, federal and state, have a great role to play in leading by example, particularly with in relation to mental health and well-being, like for projects like Beyond Blue, etc. However, there seem to be some hypocrisy, for lack of a better word, when it comes to them leading by example with the bickering and contempt they show for each other. How do you think that impacts on these sorts of programs?
I'm employed by the government. So.
And I definitely am.
I'll have a go. I want to pay tribute today to Linda Burney, MP, who spoke out so bravely some years ago about her own experiences of domestic violence. And those of us who work with women, we're not a domestic violence specialist service, but it is such a large part of what our clients bring when they bring a workplace issue, and increasingly so. When Linda spoke out, that was like a breath of fresh air, and showed leadership and showed compassion and showed a deep understanding of what women in Australia get up and face and come to work and face every day. Linda left a violent relationship when it was no longer safe for her and her children. It's very sad that her son passed away 2 days ago.
She's now on leave, coping with his death and all of that brings to her family. So she's a great role model in terms of leading by example, bravely speaking about things that many of us keep silent because we're too scared to. But I take your point, there is nothing more toxic than working with toxic people. And unfortunately in our line of work, we see that every day as well. A lot of what Chris had to say and Marty had to say about how do you identify a healthy workplace culture talked about feeling validated, and I think there's no bigger gift we can give to employees than to validate the whole of them, not just their capacity and their contribution to productivity as workers. We're not robots. We don't just go and perform a function. We bring to our jobs everything that our human experience gives us. And we're currently doing a fair bit of work with people who have chosen to come to South Australia and make this their home. So they're new to our state. They're under a whole range of different visa arrangements. They may be skilled migrants. We're working with them through their attendance at English language classes. And nothing makes me more ashamed or in fact scared about their safety at work when I hear some of the stories about how they're treated, how they're viewed by employers in this state, and the workplace practices that they report to us. So we need to get better at looking after the most vulnerable workers and ensuring that when we go and look at workplaces, we're looking at everything and we're talking to those workers and hearing from them what their daily experiences are, because we're losing a lot of workplace capital by not treating those people with dignity and respect. I might finish there.
Sandra, if you don't mind hanging on to the microphone, what sort of initiatives has the Women's Working Centre sort of been engaged in to assist women in particular into healthier workplaces?
Yeah. So I'd like to introduce or round out that concept of whether our language is appropriate in our workplaces. So I challenge us all today, myself included, is the language that we use around our workers validating of them as people? Do we value the different countries that they come from, the different arrangements they have in their families? How gender inclusive is our language? Many more people now are identifying as other than binary male or female. That's a challenge for those of us who've never had to think about the way we talk about people at work. So is our language appropriate? Is it gender inclusive? Are we making assumptions that are incorrect about the way people organise their families and their relationships? Because that's really important when you come to work, that you're able to talk about that you have that acknowledged. That's a sign of someone who can be mentally healthy, not having secrets at work about what's happening at home. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is around our concepts of people with disabilities or from different races. So are we racist in the way we are treating workers, rostering workers? Are we not acknowledging the whole of people? The sort of initiatives that the Working Women's Centre, and we've been around for almost 40 years, have been working with is definitely what we would call mainstream issues, so unfair dismissals, general protections, underpayment of wages, workers' compensation claims. But we often, because of the sort of clients that we work with, have to address the other issues that they bring that have to do with them being women. So things like workplace bullying can be extremely complicated by experiences of pregnancy discrimination as well as the bullying, or sex discrimination or sexual harassment, and the sort of language that is used in workplaces when a woman joyously announces that she's having her first baby and is hit with something she absolutely did not expect in terms of the boss's reaction to that. Probably what I want to talk about most at the moment, for probably about the last 4 years, I've been working with mainly government agencies, but some local government and some of the larger not-for-profits around training managers for those organisations that are undertaking the White Ribbon Workplace accreditation, and that is getting smart about equipping workplaces to have policies and procedures around domestic and family violence and the impact of that on workplaces. We talk about 1 in 5 workers having an experience of mental health. 1 in 3 women experience domestic and family violence in their lifetime. In Australia, more than 1 woman a week dies at the hands of someone in her family. A child a fortnight dies in Australia at the hands of someone in their family. That's not a well-known statistic. And unfortunately, most women experiencing domestic violence are not tucked safely away in a women's refuge where they and their kids are safe. Like us, they get up and go to work each day and do the shopping and drop the kids to sport and do all the things that people do when they're conducting their lives in a community. So how well equipped is your workplace for a disclosure of domestic and family violence? Do you have a workplace policy? Do you have special domestic and family violence leave? If you're in the public sector, as a public sector employee, you have access to 15 days over and above your other leave entitlements to address the impact of domestic and family violence, with the proviso that you can attend to the things that happen during a crisis and not lose your job. That's the most important thing. Staying financially viable, economically sustained by not losing your job is really important at times of crisis. There's been an enormous focus on domestic and family violence in Australia, and we thank advocates like Rosie Batty for her continued work. But we're pretty new at looking at what that means if people are coming to work. What sort of risk does a perpetrator who may choose to come to the workplace to create havoc for a partner or ex-partner, what's the workplace's response? We know the duty of care, it's in the Act, but we're not very good at extending our awareness of domestic and family violence into the Act as a risk. But I believe it sits there. I believe we don't need another system to identify risk, address the risk, monitor the risk, and so on. We have a system. It's called Work Health and Safety. So we're doing a lot of work to train up workplaces and assist them have a better response, to develop a safety planning conversation with a woman who does disclose. One of the areas that's really tricky for workplaces is where a woman may have an intervention order in place, preventing a perpetrator from approaching her. Is she duty bound under the Work Health Safety Act to notify her workplace that that intervention order may be posing a risk to the workplace? None of her doing, but she's the one who's targeted. She is going to do that if she knows she's going to get a decent response and a well-managed response, and that her safety and privacy is taken into account. She's not going to do that if she's seen a bad response to other disclosures at work.
Thank you, Sandra. There's a common theme, it's been mentioned by a couple of people, and it's that culture of care. I think it starts with every individual that's here in South Australia, not just an organisational obligation. It starts with us all. Now, did I see some more hands up in the crowd? Yes, just one here.
Critical events in the workplace change culture. So this question is to you, Luke, and also Barry. The evidence is suggesting 77% of disease is health-related from the stats I heard this morning. 19,000 out of 25,000 hours working weeks lost. I work in a workers' comp jurisdiction, so obviously it's important. But more importantly, 91% of Australian surveys said mental health is important. So my question, and it taps into psych-related claims now need to cross a new threshold, that being that work has to be the significant contributing factor. With all this said, the question is this: how do you see case law being established in SA? Because we've found that changes in culture towards safety matters has been as a result of decisions made in the court.
Thanks very much for the question. Firstly, I'm not actually a return to work specialist in terms of the return to work. I'm looking at Marty now in terms of her knowledge of the Return to Work Act and cases in relation to psychological cases that are now dealt with under the Return to Work Act. So I don't know if I can defer to those next to me. I'm happy to talk about the obligations under the health. Yes, okay.
That's where it's coming from.
Yeah, sure.
There is no real penalty under the Return to Work legislation. My business will just pick up the cost.
Yeah.
But that's not going to change culture. Not unless there's a significant rise in it, because then they'll look at it from a business proposition. This is crazy waste of money.
That's right. Well, I guess from a safety perspective, Barry went through this in his presentation, that primary obligation, saying, well, we've got an obligation to provide, so far as is reasonably practical, a healthy workplace. There hasn't been any prosecutions in relation to bullying as such in South Australia, but there have been examples interstate, and obviously that horrific case in the Cafe Vamp decision and what led to Brodie's law in Victoria led to the criminal bullying legislation. I guess from a South Australian perspective, there is scope under the WHS legislation to bring what would be a Category 1 offence for creating a risk of serious risk of injury or illness, and obviously fines of up to $3 million and 5 years imprisonment, which would cover something similar to what we see under the Victorian legislation. I guess if I can move on to come back to the law, I guess, as well, in terms of the legal framework. From the legal framework, and credit to Beyond Blue and to Catherine, if you wanted to see what the legal framework is, the law in terms of health is very tricky, but it's a great summary on the Beyond Blue website, which is fantastic. I had a look at it this morning in preparation for today. But if we can just pin it down to 3 parts. Firstly, the part, I guess, in terms of disability discrimination, Disability Discrimination Act. So an employer can't discriminate if you've got a disability, firstly. Mental health can be a disability for the purpose of the legislation. So that then in that regard, if you fit within that particular criteria, then an employer has an obligation to make reasonable adjustments in the workplace, unless, of course, it causes unjustifiable hardship. Now, unjustifiable hardship is then dealt with by way of case law and on the specific circumstances, which is then covered under Section 11 of the Disability Discrimination Act. So we deal with that one firstly. Secondly, Barry's touched on the health and safety legislation, the WHS Act. But thirdly, and perhaps equally as tricky, is the privacy legislation. So obligations in relation to keeping people's medical information private, seeking to get consent in those situations, but treating everyone's own individual circumstances as private. The only, I guess, the other flip side of that is if there is a risk to their own health and safety, then that would be an exception towards those privacy obligations. So that's, I guess, the framework in the way in which the law deals with health and I guess mental health.
Can I just ask a quick question there, Lou? Is there anything on the horizon where that burden of proof may look like to be changed in the future around psychological issues?
Not to my knowledge, Glenn, but was that a leading question? Are you aware of something that, in terms of burden of proof?
Absolutely not.
We have to remember, I guess, in terms of health and safety legislation, that it is underpinned to effectively criminal legislation. So that, excuse me, that burden of proof is as per the Criminal Act, criminal legislation. Of course, in relation to health and safety legislation, you just need to prove a guilty act. Unlike purely in criminal law, you need to prove guilty mind and a guilty act. In the majority of health and safety offences, you just have to prove a guilty act. So the failing to provide a safe workplace is enough for a conviction in health and safety legislation. The one exception to that is where you've been recklessly indifferent towards health and safety, and that's the Category 1 type offences, and those are the things which would be covered. Say, for instance, in an extreme bullying case in the workplace where if it was the organisation knew or ought to have known that their acts or omissions would create a risk to health and safety.
Luke, can I just add to that? That's where my concern. I'm loud. My concern is that a Category 1 offence requires that reckless endangerment, and we know that we've seen good turnaround in regards to attitudes because of certain prosecutions that have occurred. My fear here is in South Australia there will be something horrific that happens to somebody, and I've seen some pretty shitty stuff. And I don't want to see that, and that's what the fear is, and that's why I suppose the second part of the question was towards Barry. What are you going to need to look for to get this element of the picture for us to be able to create change in attitude and culture in SA?
Just mention Luke covered all that very well and explained the framework of legislation. So glad you did that for me. So the reason I brought it up in my presentation around case law is because we don't have recent case law at present under the Workplace Safety Act, especially in relation to workplace bullying. I'll use that as the vehicle to discuss it, but it's coming inevitably. And I've touched the point you said. You said you don't want to see that happen. But it is a fact in our workplace. There are some extremely poor behaviours in our workplace, and the team that I manage were on the front of the front line of responding to those issues. It isn't here yet. The case law's not here in South Australia, and sadly there's been some tragic events that have driven case law in other states. We will get case law in South Australia. It will happen at some stage. I don't know when that will happen. Some of the challenges around obtaining that case law is the burden of proof, and there was a good relevant question there is, has it changed? No, the burden of proof, or will it change? No, the burden of proof is high because the consequences under the legislation are high, the penalties are high. So the burden of proof is necessarily at beyond all reasonable doubt, as it would be for other criminal legislation. And it's a challenge to prove a case at that level, to obtain the evidence, and for it to stand up to scrutiny from our own legal counsel, for it to go through to court, for it to be examined by defence. These are high burdens to reach, so they're necessarily set at that level. So is case law coming? Sadly, it probably is, yeah, and it will probably be safe work that's on the forefront of pursuing a case to and will inevitably create that case law.
Question down the front here. Thank you.
I was just wondering, Barry, whether you've got any statistics on the number of complaints that you get around what we're talking about today, and any trends in that. And then probably the follow-up question would be then, are you resourced well enough, A, to get case law, and B, to resolve some of the issues and educate from that platform?
Sure, thank you for the question. I won't give a statistical answer to that. There's a reason for that. We're collating presently, so any statistic I gave now could be proved wrong in a few days' time. We're looking at those numbers at present, or I am. But to talk about trends and resources, it's probably something I'd like to focus on. So in trends, what we see in the unit that I work in is that our trend is heading towards workers are definitely becoming more aware of the legislation themselves, either that's by direct experience or it's by training in the workplace or general awareness because of events like this. But so certainly the complaints that we receive, the trend is people understand more and are able to articulate how the behaviour is affecting them, and they're certainly able to translate that into some of the terminology that's current at present as well. So we're seeing a growing awareness in workers. A trend as well is that many businesses that have been in the situation where they've dealt with complaints internally, that experience of dealing with investigation telly educates the business itself. It means that they're able to spot it earlier. So often we're seeing complainants that are far more prepared to articulate their complaint. They're able to do it better. And in many cases, businesses, when we engage with them, often if they've had that experience in the past, or they've had an investigation in the past, they really have taken those experiences on board and created some safety systems and have responded to individual circumstances. In relation to Safe Work's own resourcing, I can answer that yes. Currently, I feel confident that the team that I'm managing, there's some sufficient resources and I've got the right individuals in that team. So the answer is presently yes. I think demand in the future is going to grow in this area. With awareness of employers and awareness of employees increasing, I think the demand's only going to grow. So I'm hoping for a situation in the future will match resources with demand. Presently, I think we are.
Question from Paul.
Thanks, Glenn. I guess I just have a practical question. I understand that there isn't case law in it, and it's a very difficult thing to get a bullying case over the line as such. I think that's what we're agreeing to. So if I encounter someone who's in a bullying situation where they they need some direction in terms of where to go or what to do in order to be able to change that workplace, change the situation, hopefully change the workplace, is Safe Work the best avenue to start with? Because it seems to me that that's your sort of thing, and that's not necessarily going to achieve an outcome of having a case against an employer. And I'm wondering, are there other avenues then, return to work? I guess I don't know about the other avenues that could be, facilitated by someone. The other option is, would it be better to put in a unsafe workplace complaint rather than a bullying complaint? So, just wondering about your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll talk on behalf of Safe Work SA. No, I'll just say that Safe Work SA does have an educator arm within Safe Work. So if you wanted information, advice, assistance in relation to what to do in relation to a bullying issue or what systems or processes should be put in place, then there's a free service where you can actually get an educator to come out and actually talk to you, or you can talk over the phone. Certainly.
Sorry about that. I am an educator in Safe Work SA.
Well, there you know all about it.
Well, this is the thing. I guess I don't. So that's where I'm asking the question, because this question may come up, and I'd like to know what I just said.
So, certainly the Safe Work Australia guidance material is a great place to start, because it does talk about the systems that you can put in place as far as having appropriate policies, codes of conduct, and it has some sample guidance documents there. I think there's information available. There's certainly information available on the Heads Up website as well in relation to bullying and harassment, and so there's information. There's the Safe Work Australia guidance documents. There's Safe Work SA that you can go to get information and advice. There's a Fair Work Commission as well, where you can ring up and get information and advice in relation to bullying and harassment, and probably the Working Women's Centre as well.
Thank you, Marty. Yes, Working Women's Centre, I think, I don't want to over-egg the cake, but I think we were the first very humbly organisation that started to question where do people go who are bullied. There was no legislation when we did our first lot of research around this, and we now have a special jurisdiction, the workplace bullying jurisdiction through the Fair Work Commission, where people can go. And we're very happy to take calls from people who are experiencing bullying, because we've been working in this area for such a long time. And our conversations, our first conversations with someone seeking information or support, are usually very long. Those calls, depending on someone's ability to keep talking, sometimes will suggest that they go and have a break, and we'll call them back later, because it's very taxing, very emotional to go through the whole series of what's been happening. Because by the time people ring for information or support, I think someone mentioned it before, they may have been experiencing bullying for a number of years, certainly months, before it crystallises into something's happening to me and it's not okay. So we very much work with our clients in a way that's about, first of all, hearing their story. So as many aspects of that story and the impact on them, not just at work, but in their families as well. Is this impacting on your close relationships, your ability to function in life? And we would make appropriate referrals to places like Beyond Blue. We're very fond of asking people, once we give them a whole lot of information, and bullying cannot be pinned down to here's one course of action that will work for you. So we talk about here's a range of actions that you might consider taking. So we'll explore if there's elements of discrimination as part of the complaint, and talk about, it may be disability discrimination, talking about an avenue there, and explaining what someone would have to do to access that and what a likely outcome might be. So we talk through a whole range of approaches, because everyone is different. What people have in common when they're being bullied is they want the bullying to stop. Now, we don't have the means to go into a workplace and order that to happen, and I think Barry mentioned before, there are always two sides to the story, but we will advocate for clients. And we talk through a range of approaches, from doing nothing. So you can choose to keep trying to get up and go to work each day and face what's happening. And if you do that, the likely outcome is probably going to be a breakdown in your health. And then you may never return to that workplace. In fact, you may never work again. So that's a highly likely outcome of doing nothing. Through to a whole range of approaches. It may be a workers' compensation claim. So we talk about all of the risks that go with that, and the stigma of having that on your record forever. People are very worried about that still. And then we work with people to make a good decision that fits for them. One avenue may be, let's get you out of that workplace. You absolutely are not safe to continue going to work there. How might we go about that? So that doesn't address what's happening systemically in that workplace, of course, but if we say to someone, you have to keep going to work every day and address this for everyone at work, we're being negligent. So someone's health and safety is the most important concern. So lots of referrals, maybe a referral to a doctor. We talk about mental health plans where people can get support through their GP as well to manage what's happening to them.
Just to take up Sandra's point there, you can be in the Fair Work Commission within about 2 or 3 days. Part of the Julia Gillard changes was the anti-bullying legislation, so it's want the bullying to stop, and you can put in an application and be in there within about 2 or 3 days. Now, for state government employees, you will obviously have enterprise agreements where you can raise complaints through that and go through a similar process, not quite the same, but very similar process. So they're the instruments that you can use industrially to raise those particular issues. And also, Safe Work SA, remembering, I think it's section 81 or 91 of the WHS legislation, you can actually appoint an inspector or ask an inspector to come out and resolve to deal with a workplace problem. So they can come in and try and resolve issues between an employee and an employer. I'm not sure if it's been used yet in South Australia, but it's hiding there in the legislation. I think it's Section 81 or Section 91 of the legislation.
Yes, it has. I could address that. Yeah, on a few occasions it has been. Yeah, that's the case. Just to support what Sandra and Luke said, is that often safe work can say we're kind of more often than not the end point of someone's journey to be heard over their particular workplace issues. So often we find that wrapped up in the person's story around what they're calling bullying is discrimination issues, is racism as well. So some of those issues that they tend to combine into one narrative that we hear at the end. So a lot of our time in not just in investigating that matter, but in referring the matter are to agencies like what Sandra represents and also fellow commission as well. So it is, in many respects, sometimes it might not feel to the end person it's a multi-jurisdictional approach, but certainly to us it does feel like a multi-jurisdictional approach when we're making those referrals. So are there other places that someone can go before safe work? Yes, of course. Part of a mentally healthy workplace, what's interesting is that the mentally healthy workplace should be what the norm is. It's not, but it should be, and it should be where we're working towards. But the mentally healthy workplace for me should function at its best at the point things start going wrong for individual workers, managers, people in the agency or the organisation. That's when it should function, so that those systems that do exist stop the escalation of that to agencies like us, and it's resolved internally. So often it's not, and there's a big journey to be done in relation to that. But so often I think that the function of a mentally healthy workplace is that when things start to go wrong, those support systems, those internal strengths organisations have should operate at that point to try and reduce the amount that gets to meet people like me at the far end of the complaint.
Just to lead on from that proactive conversation, if we think about our next generation of workers, our children and our young people, I'm wondering what we should be putting into place as South Australia to support their worker wellbeing, knowing that they're our future employees and the future of our state, especially in the transition points, leaving secondary and also tertiary education.
I might ask Chris, is there anything in the strategic plan that may, I know you said it starts with the individual, the workplace, etc. Is there something in the strategic plan that may look at educating even our children?
Absolutely, because the statistics are quite stark. And I don't want to be the numbers guy, but they are quite stark. If we accept that 45% of Australians will at some point in their life experience a diagnosable mental illness, then a lot of the population, 45%. But when you look at the youth figures, it's particularly important. Brain development commences 3 weeks after conception, and 80% of brain development occurs in the first 4 years of life. So if you're not putting your effort into that preconception to age 5 area right up front, you're missing a significant opportunity. The other key statistic is that for the 45% of people who will experience a diagnosable mental illness, for 50% of them, half of them, that mental illness will onset between the age of 11 and 14. By age 24, 75% is onset. So if we're not looking in that early generation area, if we're not building the resilience and helping parents to be good parents and understand how they can help people who are experiencing mental illness before they're 24, we're missing 75% of those people who are going to suffer mental illness. So in answer to your question, the plan has to look at the next generation. How do we look after our young ones and how do we build their resilience going forward?
And I have some good news on that front, which is really exciting. Fortunately, Beyond Blue received some significant federal government funding in the middle of this year, and we are working on the National Education Program. So the program that it enhances and builds on what currently is the Kids Matters and the Mind Matters programs that are available in the schools, which are national programs as I understand. but the focus is to bring that together, and so that the National Education Program looks at kindergarten. How do we create positive, highly functioning, good mental health from kindergarten, and age appropriate, I might say, kindergarten through to tertiary, and also how do we build capability in the education sector, so the teachers and the principals, and how do we create mentally healthy schools and children who are have high emotional intelligence and high emotional sort of self-control, and prepare them for the workplace. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have then is how do we equip our workplaces to be prepared for these young people coming through who might be, and I suspect will be, much more capable of managing their own mental health and have much higher standards of our workplaces than perhaps we do now, and less tolerance for some of the poor behaviours and the disrespectful behaviours and the incivility that has been in workplaces for a long time, that does lead to workplace bullying, and their intolerance for that, and what can we do in terms of creating workplaces that are ready to receive this next generation, who will have higher expectations than we have had today.
Thank you. We've probably got time for maybe one or two more questions before we wrap up. Is anybody, yes, at the front here?
Just going back to what can we do in the workplace and that burden proof and everything. When we're dealing with sort of physical work safety incidences, we have an incident report form that we fill out, we have audits that we perform. For me, I guess I haven't been able to find any resources in regards to being able to do a mentally healthy workplace audit, or to be able to provide people that opportunity to fill out an incident report when they sort of exit a meeting or something like that and they've had a bad experience, so that we can monitor that and we can be aware of that, you know, to sort of open up those conversations where people might not necessarily feel comfortable. I just want to hear your ideas about where we might be able to find those resources or the information to inform developing something like that.
Thank you for the question. There's quite a few resources in relation to work-related stress. So Western Australia have put together like a psychological risk guide, and I think in there there's like an audit tool that you can use to look at what work stressors are actually happening within your workplace. There's also, heads up, I've got a really quick, useful tool. It's only 11 questions where you can actually look at strategies for implementing a mentally healthy workplace. So it talks about what are you doing as far as raising awareness, reducing stigma, supporting individuals, but also managing risks. So you can actually again look at what risks are in the workplace, the impacts on mental health, and then that provides a bit of an audit tool as well. I know workplaces are looking at their health and safety systems and making sure that their health and safety systems are picking up on psychological risks. So they're starting to actually look at their incident reporting systems and saying, okay, what on our incident report form can we actually identify psychosocial risks? So can we actually identify workloads, work demands, emotional demands, workplace bullying, aggressive incidents? Are we actually picking up and reporting those issues? So if we start picking up and reporting the issues, then we can actually start addressing the issues within the workplace. So I know that some health and safety practitioners are actually looking at their health and safety policies and procedures with a mental health lens, and just making sure that psychological risk is being picked up through their systems. But certainly there's lots of resources in relation to work-related stress through WorkSafe Victoria, WA, and also I know that Safe Work Australia at the moment is developing a psychological injury prevention guide, which is in draft at the moment. So there will be more guidance material coming out from a national level about what workplaces can do to actually manage psychological risks particularly from a legislative point of view as well.
Maybe I'll just add to that, on the Heads Up website, we also link to other very good international tools from the likes of Guarding Minds at Work, the Health and Safety Executive in the UK. So they are kind of risk profiling tools that you can use to identify what the psychological risk is to your workplace and profile that. In addition, on the Beyond Blue site, there's also a very simple K10 checklist that allows individuals to look at what are the, how are they travelling in terms of their own mental health, and it looks at key indicators for anxiety and depression over 10 very simple questions. Now they can either do that and you can capture that information and see how your organisation's going. You can do it de-identified, or you can encourage people just to do it as a check-in. And if you're in the process of, having regular one-on-one catch-ups in terms of supervision catch-ups, staff and managers, having people really well equipped to have a conversation and how to start that conversation. And through that, they will be able to gauge how their staff are travelling, and you potentially will get a bit of a heat map in your organisation. Not statistically driven, but certainly anecdotally. And if that gives you some leading indicators about what's happening and what's working well, then that's something else to work with.
Can I just mention too, there's a fantastic homegrown tool here in South Australia, developed by Maureen Dollard and others at University of Adelaide, I think, which can measure the psychosocial health climate of your organisation. So that tool has been developed over time. It too will identify hotspots in your organisation. So it's tried and tested, and now very sophisticated in terms of working out what exactly is going on, because sometimes when people say what they think is going on, that's not the complete picture. So it looks at systemic issues in the organisation as well.
What was it called, sorry? What organisation?
University of Adelaide. UniSA, sorry about that.
And I believe it is actually available through Safe Work SA's library service as well. So if you'd like to obtain a copy of that, come and see us at Keswick.
Just also, Glenn, just wanted to mention the Augusto Zado Award this year was in relation to research that's done in a risk assessment tool for workplace bullying as well. So
right. Michelle Tuckey.
So Michelle Tuckey, again, University of South Australia, is doing some great research in regards to a risk assessment tool for workplace bullying. Yeah.
So she's just won that award. So come this time next year, those resources will be available also. We've come to an end for this session, unfortunately, so I hope there wasn't any burning questions, but if there was, I'm sure our panel members will be hanging around during the break. Please join me in thanking Chris, Barry, Mardy, Luke, Sandra, Corey and Catherine for their time today. It's been a great opportunity for discussion, and we've just got a very small token of appreciation, so thank you, panel members.